Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome. My name's Charlie Jeffrey, Senior Vice Principal. Welcome to Professor Richard Freeman's inaugural lecture, marking his promotion to a chair in social science and public policy. Now, inaugurals are very special occasions, one of the actually rather rare occasions when a scholar has the opportunity and indeed the requirement to talk about his or her work and discipline or disciplines to an audience unconstrained by departmental boundaries and indeed membership of the university. And it's an especial pleasure to welcome Richard's family here tonight and others from beyond the university community. Great to see an audience also from within the university, ranging from undergraduate students to the odd emeritus professor dotted around the room. Welcome to you all. As many of you will know, Richard is a remarkable scholar. He joined us in 1994 after stints in Dundee, in Manchester where he did his doctorate, and Oxford where he took a BA in modern history and modern languages. I've known Richard quite well. I landed here in 2004 and was in the next door office to him, so I've had occasion to observe him, and I've picked out 6 distinguishing features of Professor Richard Freeman and his life and works. Firstly, he doesn't care for disciplinary boundaries. His work has drawn from political science, sociology, anthropology, science and technology studies, and literary theory. Out of all that, I think, comes a rare creativity. It's a sign of a sense of curiosity. And I think that curiosity and creativity will be a hallmark of the lecture you will hear tonight. Working across boundaries, Richard is about to move department from politics and international relations to social policy. Normally, when somebody moves department, it is to solve a problem, but not in this case. I think it's to take up an opportunity as Richard's interests have shifted in their focus and working across disciplinary boundaries to make him more appropriately in another department. And not many people move departments without some kind of problem underlying it, so he's a great exception. Secondly, interdisciplinarity has a corollary, and that's collaboration. Richard works avidly with colleagues from across departments here at the University of Edinburgh, but also in leading locations worldwide. Richard has had spells in the US, in Germany, in Italy, in France and in Austria, often holding prestigious fellowships to enable that. Thirdly, I've rarely seen someone as committed as Richard to developing the careers of others, not least what's by now the busful of 28 PhD students and 8 postdocs that Richard has had a hand in supervising and mentoring. Fourth distinguishing feature, Richard doesn't do social science for its own sake, but for what it can do to inform and enhance the practice of what we study. So he's worked over the years with the World Health Organization, the Department for International Development here, the US Department of Health, the European Commission, the Lothian Health Board, and the Tavistock Clinic, amongst others. Fifth, Richard is a good citizen, almost to the extent that you might call him a glutton for punishment. He has been, for the School of Social and Political Science or its predecessor faculty, at various times Director of Quality Assurance, Director of Undergraduate Teaching, Director of Knowledge Transfer, and Director of the Graduate School, the latter when I was head of school, and I can say personally his was an outstanding and above all a wise contribution. The last thing that marks Richard out is that he's a good man, someone who in his academic and his personal guises gives more than he takes. Now his lecture tonight has a beguilingly simple title, Doing Politics. The short summary he's given me asks the question, when we do politics, what are we doing? Now there's a question many of us would like our serving politicians to be able better to answer. Fortunately, we and they have Richard to help them. So Richard, please.
I must say I didn't feel particularly nervous until you started on all that. Well, here we are. I can't quite believe you're all here. Thank you for coming. I've been saying that because I can't really believe that I'm here, and I'm absolutely thrilled to bits. So thank you all for your various parts in it. Everything that Charlie said was not done alone, of course. It was done with you all. So thank you in advance. Given that I am here, I've challenged myself with the question over the last few months as to, well, if you're a professor, what do you profess, professor? That classic question, and it's a daunting one. But I want to try and give some kind of answer today. And I really, in a sentence, all I want to do is to ask what might happen if we proceed. If in thinking about politics, we proceed from a theory of action, rather than from power or the state or institutions or interests, what if we begin with what people do and what kind of ways of thinking about and understanding politics might result from that? I figured I should begin in the here and now, which, this being a university, means halfway around the world and 3 or 4 years ago. But there's a couple of bits I'm going to read. The rest I shall try to ad-lib. On 17th September 2011, a group of protesters began to occupy Zuccotti Park in New York's financial district. They were acting partly in response to a call from Adbusters, the Vancouver-based magazine and media foundation made earlier in the summer. That call invoked the spirit of Tahrir Square, which had been the centre of the uprising in Cairo in January. The gathering in Zuccotti Park grew partly as a result of attempts by police to close it down. Over the next few weeks, parallel actions took place in cities around the world. The protest was at once political, inspired by anarchist thought and practice, and theatrical, an antic and Dadaist spectacle. It was also an experiment in sustained collective action. It was a camp, an ancient social form adopted as the basis for contemporary social and political innovation. It had a kitchen, a sleeping zone, a medical facility, and bins of books, a people's library. It developed a division of labour, distributed across working groups tasked with functions such as cleaning or liaising with supporters. It had its own energy source, using fixed bicycles to power batteries for heaters and kitchen appliances. It had a phone charging station and a nerve centre of closely guarded computer equipment. It produced a newspaper, the Occupied Wall Street Journal, and streamed its activities live on the internet. It had a system of policing by swarming, in which miscreants were surrounded by bystanders. Interestingly, it had many of the attributes and accoutrements of a small state. It also, by the same token, had a means of collective deliberation and decision-making, the General Assembly. Because the protesters had no permit to use amplification in a public space, GA meetings were conducted by means of the people's mic, with which a speaker was made audible by the crowd repeating his or her words. Agreement and disagreement was signalled by an elaborate system of hand gestures among the audience. More generally, beyond the General Assembly, living in Zuccotti Park was characterized by endless, spontaneous talking. Notoriously, the protesters refused to make any specific political demands. They were frequently challenged to do so and spent much time debating whether or not they should. What mattered for them, the point of it all, was what they referred to as the process. Arguably, one of the interesting things about the process is that the camp was essentially everything that was required to sustain the meeting. This was all about a meeting. Occupy Wall Street and the wider protests of which it was part raised many questions. These have to do with the inequalities and unsustainabilities of the prevailing capitalist economic order, the inadequacies of its corollary political order, parliamentary democracy, and the opportunities and risks associated with its rapidly evolving energy and information technologies. But the immediate question they prompted was, what do you want? I think that was the wrong question, both for those who asked it, who seemed to conclude that the answer was nothing, and for those it was asked of, for whom there was no answer. The real question, I think, was not what do you want, but what are you doing? I think the answer, and I want to go on and elaborate on this obviously, is that they were doing politics. A little aside, what politics they were doing, they were demonstrating. And we often think of demonstrating as marching and shouting and so on, campaigning perhaps. This was demonstrating support for a cause, that is. This was demonstrating in a slightly different sense, rather in the sense of perhaps a laboratory experiment or demonstrating a new technology. They were showing how things might otherwise be. This was a demonstration of what might be possible. That's what they were doing. But then, what might it mean more generally to do politics? What is politics and how is it done? I have 3 sections to my talk. The first to explore a little bit about what we might mean by politics and what we might mean by politics in the context of a theory of action. I want to focus on particular sets of actions, tasks if you like, or core activities of politics, meetings and documents, and then to get my retaliation in first, to ask the so what question. What is politics? Let's think of it as a mode of doing, of marching, meeting, canvassing, speaking, consulting, inquiring, debating, proposing, negotiating, deciding, instructing, and perhaps also listening, feeling, hoping. It's very difficult to think of politics or to activate any immediate sense of politics without so many actions, verbs. But what are we doing when doing politics? What's this doing all about or for? One of the classic definitions of politics is Laswell's succinct who gets what, when, how. Laswell wrote that was the first edition of his classic, written in 1936, and I just wanted to note that 1936 was the year my father was born. And so much of who gets what, when, how depends on when and where your father was born, still. And there is a whole way of thinking about and exploring politics that depends essentially on socioeconomic structures, of course. But it also matters very much who your father was, who your parents were, who they are, what they did. There's much doing that we forget in just taking for granted the distribution of goods according to socioeconomic circumstances and structures. I move then to the next generation of political scientists, Easton's famous definition of politics as those interactions through which values are authoritatively allocated for a society, often reduced in, as we introduce our papers by needing to begin somewhere, we talk about the production of collectively binding decision. And I go back to it because I think it's a wonderful definition, and I think it's not immediately obvious. I want to be clear that I want to define it in the broadest possible sense. That's to say, it includes all the actions through which we think about, argue about, imagine what we might want and how we might achieve them. All of us. I don't just mean politicians, members of political parties, don't just mean political activists, all of us. I've wondered, there's a paper accompanying the lecture, and I've wondered about trying to develop an understanding of politics as action about action. All of these modes of doing are actions designed to prompt or invite or prohibit other actions. Let's talk a little bit about, let me talk a little bit about action. And I'm rehearsing. This is Anselm Strauss, Chicago formed sociologist who ended up in California. Strauss wrote a wonderful book towards the end of his life, summing up a career of work on work, essentially, work on action, called The Continual Permutations of Action, and makes, as do others writing about action, the following key points. I'm out of range. Action, here I'm talking about doing as much as doing politics. This is really general and really fundamental. Action is almost always, in fact, interaction. Our actions are prompted by the actions of others and prompt, in turn, reactions. We are interacting, if not with other people, though we almost always inevitably are, with tools and materials. Action happens, obviously, to the extent that there are laws of physics, action happens somewhere at some time and in some place. Action is situated, and it's the situation to which we need to pay attention. Action also has to make sense, really. Action is done, carried out, in order to make sense. What we do is in fact our making sense of the action of others, and it needs to be intelligible to others who might respond to our actions. Action is in that sense meaningful, or sequences of actions develop meaning over time. Actions likewise may be routine. Many of our actions are routine. Much of my email exchanges are routine. Action may also be problematic. Sometimes sequences, ordinary things break down. A colleague is unable to give a lecture. Who's going to do it? There needs to be some politics kind of happens in the interstices of sequences of action breaking down. We have to solve problems and come together to work out new sequences of action. So action, but politics too, just as much if not more so, is always provisional, to sum up these 4 bullets. Provisional in the sense that there's a sense of always working somehow ad hoc, but also provisional in the sense of each action forming some kind of resource or stimulus to further action. Herman van Rompuy, President of the European Council, reflected last year on leaving office. The European Council is generally considered to be the highest political authority in the Union, but the job description and formal competencies of its president are rather vague, even meagre. A lot, therefore, depends on what you do with it or make of it. I can put it differently. Everything that was not foreseen formally had to be created informally. Politics from the inside, and even at the very top, seems ad hoc, experimental, problem-solving, improvisational. Let's think of work, which Strauss himself described as a major form of action. Much action is work. We spend much of our lives doing work. I acknowledge I am taking one of three. There are many more roads, paths through thinking about action. We might theorize action as a kind of practice, as a whole literature on practices. We might theorize action as drama. Action is done by actors performing certain roles according to certain scripts on certain stages, and so on and so forth. I've turned, actually, I don't want to have turned away from those. They're still important sources of inspiration for me and for others doing this kind of work. Just to think about work very simply. A couple of parameters to thinking about work. And this is to draw on Dorothy Smith, the godmother of institutional ethnography, who defines work simply as anything done by people that takes time and effort, that they mean to do, that is done under definite conditions and with whatever means and tools, and that they may have to think about. It's what Smith described as a generous definition. Generous because she wanted to capture all kinds of work, including, for her purposes at the time, women's domestic labour, often otherwise ignored and made invisible as work. But it suits me as an equally generous definition of much of what people are doing when they're doing politics. The idea of work, though, gives me a couple of variables through which to think about it. One is trajectory. Just lost my trajectory. Oh. Work has trajectory and involves transformation. Work is a process, to leave labour process theory aside. Work is a process. We might ask about work, and I will come to ask about political work. What actions are required to complete a task? Do they have an order or a sequence? What must happen for work to pass from one phase to the next? With what other tasks is it articulated or aligned? Difficult to think of any kind of work as anything other than a form of interaction, provisional and improvisational. Work, if work is worth doing, it's presumably, it's designed, its purpose is to bring about some kind of transformation. Therefore, what we must ask, what has been turned into what? What's been added, what's been taken away? Have actors, location, or materials changed? All I'm trying to do here is offer a framework in which to think a little bit more specifically and substantially about action and the kinds of action that politics entails. Last slide before I get onto some of the real stuff, which is really only to ask, what is real? What is politics? To go back and ask again in the light of our foundational definitions, if we begin to think about action, what have we done to our understanding of politics? Well, I pick up another of Easton's sometimes missed reflections. We may visualize a political system, he says, as a giant communications network into which information in the form of demands is flowing and out of which a different kind of information we call a decision emerges. If such an output is to be possible, there must be various intermediary processes, the consequences of which are to permit passage of, winnow out, combine and recombine the incoming messages so as to mold them into a number and kind that can be conveniently managed by decision makers. Our task is to examine and understand the way in which the conversion process moves this information along the network from the point of entry to exit, regulating any possible stress on the system that might emerge. All I want to note is that if you go back to the verbs with which I began, doing politics is a process of processing representations. Claims, accounts, warrants, demands, values are all somehow versions of the world that we hurl at each other, exchange with each other, combine with others. . That's to say that politics is often the work of I don't just mean this in the formal institutionalized sense. We have it in respect of liberal democracy. We send representatives to parliament. All of politics is somehow about taking or making, producing some kind of account of the world and throwing it into exchange with other complementary or competing accounts. Much of our politics then, of action about action, is always talk about action, but I don't want to take the action element out of talking and arguing and debating, claiming, visualizing, representing, and so on. I've written, this is the kind of thing you're supposed to do in an inaugural lecture, is refer to your own previous work. I've written about translation in the past and don't really want to do so again right now. The point of all of this is that we end up with an ontology of politics is necessarily ethereal. It's something mobile, fluid, uncertain. To fix it is to stop it and to kill it and to end it. We should expect politics to be a process of always becoming. It never settled. So, section 2. Let's think about some political work. Here's some politics going on. It's going on in a district of Ethiopia. It's a meeting, clearly. They're both the two kinds of meetings. Sometimes lots of people, sometimes fewer people. And not much more. People in a space together. A few materials, notably documents, here on the left as much as on the right. A table, there's a table in this room on the left that happens to be at the front and out of the photograph. And this is not in any way to talk about the exoticism of Ethiopian politics, though in some sense it's sometimes exotic. It's really not. My point is to show the kind of how similar and familiar that is. Doing politics is sitting around with documents, talking. The technology of politics is fascinatingly simple. What we do with words and bits of paper. And you can do as sophisticated politics as here, as sophisticated as it, if not more so. That could be a cabinet. Technologically speaking, interactionally speaking, that could be a cabinet meeting anywhere in the world. I want to point just to, I have to acknowledge the empty chair here. And she's moved from the empty chair there to, from the front row to nearly the front row here. My photographer, it's shown me so much. Thank you. I want to endorse this picture, a representation of politics, with a couple of quotations. When someone asks me what I do at work, I read, this is a senior policy officer, I read, write, and have meetings. That's what I do. Here's another one. The two things that civil servants do is write papers and have meetings. From that, things happen. Extraordinary though it might seem. And I'll come back, I want to talk about the extraordinariness a bit later. In the square brackets are the names of the two graduate students who came up with these nuggets and gleefully brought them back to me in the course of their research. They stand for, I think Charlie referred to a busload. I've thought of it as a gang, a cadre of graduate students to whom, I've been indebted. So, and some of you are here. Thank you. But look, the point is, that's all it is so often. Even, we can go back to go back to Zuccotti Park. What are they doing? Talking to each other. Okay, they might have email and they might be tweeting each other, but there are still, it's all about talk and text in some form. Let me talk about talk and text in turn. Meetings to begin with. Politics begins in meeting. Committee meeting, the council, the cabinet, the summit, the parliament, the debate, the conference, the personal appointment, the telephone call, the demonstration, and the sit-in. What are people doing? When we look at ethnographic accounts, everyday accounts of people doing politics, the life of the MEP, for example, we find people stumbling and rushing from one meeting to the next. I've also written about meetings and what the trajectory of meetings, certain kinds of discussion meeting which try to set up a problem, degenerate into confusion, become stabilized, produce some kind of outcome. Friend and colleague Frank Nuhlmeier in Bremen has written about decision-taking in federal committees in Germany as a process of proposing, accepting and confirming a particular decision. There are patterns of interaction to our meetings. But I want to talk about a particular meeting, because it's interesting. Schoolboy error, I hear some of you already wrestling with yourselves. It was Nixon who went to China. And of course, Nixon goes to China has become a kind of epithet, a way of referring to politicians making kind of counterintuitive moves. Kissinger went first, and let me tell you how. I want to give an extended example of a particular meeting because it illustrates many of the things I'm concerned with here. Richard Nixon went to China in February 1972, opening diplomatic relations with Mao and changing the dynamics of the Cold War. Henry Kissinger, as Secretary of State, went to China 6 months before, in July 1971, in great secrecy and in order to explore the possibility of a Nixon visit. He flew to Pakistan. The Pakistan government was a kind of avenue of negotiation, a mediator. Kissinger flew to Pakistan, changed planes there before dawn on Friday, July the 9th. Imagine Kissinger sitting there in the plane, on the tarmac. The Chinese delegation, the Chinese crew comes on board, takes him and a small group of American officials onto a Chinese plane, and then you're off over the Himalaya or somewhere, on to China to change the world. Over that weekend, Kissinger spent 17 hours in meetings with Chinese Premier Chu Enlai and a further 4 hours with aides from both sides, drafting a communique. We know what happened from a lengthy and top-secret, exclusively eyes-only memorandum Kissinger wrote to Nixon on his return, in which he described the meeting as the most searching, sweeping and significant discussions I've ever had in government. He goes on. It's extremely difficult to capture in a memorandum the essence of this experience. Simply giving you a straightforward account of the highlights of our talks, potentially momentous as they were, would do violence to an event so shaped by the atmosphere and the ebb and flow of our encounter, or to the Chinese behavior so dependent on nuances and style. Thus, this memorandum will sketch the overall sequence of events and philosophic framework, as well as the substance of our exchanges, for the intangibles are crucial, and we must understand them if we are to take advantage of the opportunities we now have, deal effectively with these tough, idealistic, fanatical, single-minded and remarkable people, and thus transform the very framework of global relationships. Kissinger never modest, but anyway. After landing in Peking, the US team was taken to a government guest house. Chu arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon, and after small talk and photographs, the group moved to a conference table for 3 hours and more of discussion. They took dinner at 8 and talked again till after 11 in the evening. Next morning, they visited the Forbidden City, then went to the Great Hall of the People for more discussion. in the course of which Chu made a presentation lasting an hour and a half, responding without notes to an agenda Kissinger had set out the night before. He was tough and direct, and Kissinger had begun to respond equally robustly when Chu suggested they take lunch before it grew cold. Isn't that lovely? Towards the end of lunch, Chu started to reflect on the Cultural Revolution, describing China as torn between its fear of bureaucracy and the excesses of revolution. Chu seemed, to me at least, to be offering something up, to be giving Kissinger the opportunity to empathize. They returned to their substantive discussion of the issues at hand when, to quote Kissinger again, Chu suddenly, matter-of-factly, returned to your visit to China. He suggested the summer of 1972, when the deal was done. The meeting adjourned at 6. The US team returned to the guest house, and what Kissinger described as an evening of fits and starts, of nighttime strolls and cancelled meetings, and a complicated, occasionally painful minuet of communique drafting. All right, so what's happening here? What are Chu and Kissinger doing? They're doing politics, clearly, in what is a serious, substantive, and far-reaching negotiation of world affairs. They're working, and their work shows the characteristics of work I emphasized before. Their meeting has a trajectory, an ebb and flow, as Kissinger describes it, and consists in a sequence of events. It transforms their relationship as well as that of the countries they represent. They're also, as an intrinsic aspect of their doing political work, engaged in a social encounter, one which is partly stylized in the set choreography of interactions between host and guest, including eating and sightseeing, but it's one which also turns on the myriad subtleties of human communication. It's both highly ordered and deeply uncertain. What happened seems to have been some kind of success, and its success is one of the key reasons we know about it, why Kissinger should have wanted to write about it at such length. But it could have been otherwise, as the ethnomethodologists say. Kissinger's going to China was a meeting about meeting, and to me is the more interesting for that. I suspect it was more important, in fact, than Nixon's own going to China 6 months later, which nevertheless, of course, still had to happen. I suspect it was its most immediate and significant outcome was a document, the written account of the meeting, which comprised his memorandum to Nixon. And I have more to say about documents in a moment. For now, I'm less interested in Chu and Kissinger's diplomacy than that the world affairs with which they were concerned turned on two men getting together around a table in a room and what follows from that. To documents. Joe Mabin and I have written about documents, arguing that documents have been treated. It's hard to say that students of public policy and politics have not taken account of documents, but they've taken account of them in rather a narrow way as simply vehicles of information. Sometimes more broadly conduits of discourse. I've wanted to think about them as ways of structuring the interactions of which politics is composed. Work gets done because the document needs to get written. The document requires certain kinds of work to be done. Those certain kinds of work make for certain kinds of document. It's through the document that we can essentially read the doing of politics. Just by way of an aside, nice little example, Alberto Cambrosio and colleagues did a study of the Science and Technology Ministry in Canada, noting that there was no policy until there was a dossier, a file, a folder of documents, which could then be given to a certain civil servant, to a certain ministry, which then became responsible for it. The policy was is literally, physically inherent in the document. A representation again, and the dossier being a bundle of representations made to mesh together more or less successfully. Classic statement, another originary fundamental statement about politics. Another classic, Wildavsky's work on the budget, his first major work actually, which begins, as far as I remember, by, with a kind of pellucid, in the most literal sense, a budget is a document. Budgeting is concerned with, think of how much of our politics revolves around the budget, but it's a document. A budget is a document. Budgeting is concerned with the translation of financial resources into human purposes. Translation again. A series of goals with price tags attached. It's a web of social as well as legal relationships. As each participant acts on the budget, he receives information on the preferences of others and communicates his own desires through the choices he makes. Here the budget emerges as a network of communication in which information is continuously being generated and fed back to the participants. I'd like to propose a conception that seems useful in talking about the budgetary process as a phenomenon of human behaviour in a governmental setting. Throughout this volume, we shall be concerned with budgets as political things. Lest you think I'd be overly concerned with, overly enamoured or captured by American political science of the 30s, 50s, 60s, Cold War politics and so on, here's a fairly recent document. The Smith Commission, of course, formed to make real, to operationalise, to turn into fact the commitment to enhance the powers of the devolved Scottish institutions of state. On 19th of this is from the Smith Commission website. On 19th of September 2014, Prime Minister David Cameron announced that Lord Smith of Kelvin had agreed to oversee the process to take forward the devolution commitments on further powers for the Scottish Parliament. On 27th of November 2014, the Smith Commission published its report detailing heads of agreement on further devolution of powers to the Scottish Parliament. What was all this going to amount to? A report, and you can download it here. On 22nd of January 2015, the UK government published a command paper, another document, containing draft clauses which aim to take forward the heads of agreement contained in the Smith Commission report. Now, my point is what matters is not just what ended up in the document, though of course that matters hugely. What is interesting analytically, think about the array of meetings, the public consultations that Smith embarked on in trying to work out what should be proposed. And think then of how many civil servants have worked late into the night consulting with representatives of parties to produce something that would stand as a agreed text, something that would serve to guide our polity, through the next, well, we don't know how long, potentially forever. Look, in Section 1 of the Scotland Act, the Scottish Parliament, after subsection 1, insert, a Scottish Parliament is recognised as a permanent part of the United Kingdom's constitutional arrangements. It becomes real in the document makes it real. Occupy Wall Street was very concerned about its process, and I like the idea. We students of politics and public policy, of course, are always interested in process. What matters is not just the specific work task, small bite-sized sequences of action and interaction, but the process as a whole. I want to give a slightly different account of what I think is, in general, the political process. Reduced, I hope not quite ad absurdum, but still reduced in simplified in order that we might access and think about it differently. I am beginning to develop a conception of politics as, in some sense, a succession, a sequencing of meetings to documents to meetings. I'm drawing on research project I was involved in on knowledge in policy, acknowledge my colleague Steve on the way. Meetings, we know, make for meetings. Documents, the Smith Commission shows, makes for documents. Meetings make for documents, make for meetings. In order for what goes on in any one place to be realized in another place, it gets written down. What happens in a room, what's happening here now, is that I'm trying to exchange, offer certain kinds of ideas. They will be recorded. The document will in fact be a film here. And then it goes out into the world in some reasonably fixed sense. And will go and capture the interest, potentially, of whoever else might see it. It's the same with most of the meetings we go to are prompted by documents. We come with agendas and committee papers and so on and so forth. And we produce minutes at the very least, if not further reports, recommendations, memoranda, and so on. This is partly to do because we are dealing with different kinds of knowledge. Much of our knowledge is embodied. We carry it around with us in our heads and our bodies. We know things and we know how to do things. But if all that we knew depended on our being present in a room with others, our potential for sophisticated, coordinated, extensive action, government, would be rather limited. We have this capacity. Documents give us, we're back to Gutenberg, actually being able to write stuff down, to fix it in documents, to create what much, much later Latour calls the immutable mobile, enables government at a distance, or governing, or collective being in overextended, over time and space. The production of a document can be read in another place, in another time, in order to make common meaning with its author. I'm talking about bouncing from meeting to document to meeting. The sprung rhythms, as I have it here, that's Gerard Manley Hopkins, and that's speaking to previous life in literature and language and so on. But let's think of politics. Politics is always in motion, yes, but always bouncing from one node, from one fixed point to the next. Fixed only so long as someone else arrives to make some complementary or counter-interpretation of what's going on. Here's a quotation from that study. The success or otherwise of conclusion documents. This is a WHO official who's organised an elaborate international conference of ministers of state, health ministers, to talk about mental health policy. Got them to agree an action plan. But still, the success or otherwise of action plans is how well you as an officer manage to infiltrate the professional system. How you can get your document to be taken up and addressed, taking your document, putting it on the agenda of meetings of psychiatrists, meetings of NGO activists, and so on. This is how kind of politics is extended and sustained. I've stalled a couple of times in this slide already because I've wanted to talk about reverberation. It's Hecklow's, Hugh Hecklow, another classic study, was writing about social learning, the extent to which countries borrow or are inspired by the development of public policy in others. What one learns, he says, depends upon what one does. In both its self-instruction and self-delusions, the cobweb of socioeconomic conditions, policy middlemen and political institutions reverberates to the consequences of previous policy in a vast and premeditated design of social learning. So I get from process to reverberation. I have a sense of political life, essentially one of ripples and reverberations hung on meetings and documents. Lastly, should have you on the stand in about 5 minutes. So what? I've wanted to say something about action, about try to change our discussion of politics. I'll just shift it a little bit to room-sized politics. We should be talking more often, I think, than we commonly do in politics and public policy, of men and women with first and last names. That's Mark Smill's phrase. I want to talk about a politics that is accessible and intriguing, but perhaps also impenetrable and mysterious. Yes, but, you're all saying. The sociologists are saying, yes, but what about structure? You know, we are not free to go on as we might wish. Our actions are determined by institutions, cultures, structures around us. What about power? You political scientists are saying you must take account of interests which shape the everyday interactions of which your politics seems to be composed. Yes, of course, I'm not saying those things continue to matter. They continue to matter. But if they matter, they must be expressed or articulated in the meetings, the documents, the everyday goings-on of politics. In a sense, I'm only arguing that we should look at action in order better to understand the workings of power and structure. Action is another way of seeing structure and power. There are reasons to think that actually that's not going to be a mechanical relationship between power and action, between structure and action. The two will be articulated for sure, but there are degrees of freedom, degrees of improvisation, as I began with, in the interaction order, to use Goffman's phrase, in which we should be interested, I'm arguing. Is this politics in the end? Is this just not everyday life? Well, yes. I'm not, Charlie kind of intimated, I think he was very nice about the problems that I may or may not have had in trying to fit in different subject groups. I'm not interested in, I want to develop a conception of politics, or perhaps a conception of policy that doesn't really deal with a distinction between policy and politics. I also want a conception of action that is not either local or national or international. There's nothing, I've tried to give examples across time and across space which show a remarkable, I think, commonality of what it means or what counts as doing politics. And in order to do that, we cannot live off political science alone. We must be doing social and public policy, sociology, anthropology, STS, psychology, history, language and literature, because we're interested in politics and because it can be accessed only through all that stuff. To get that subliminal. Why should we be, I'll come on to Einstein in a moment. Why should we be doing this? Well, there are all sorts of research. This seems to me to be intrinsically interesting and understudied, underdeveloped. There's lots of stuff we might go and look at and discover and get interested in. There's equally, and I would want to take the opportunity to make this point now, that there's much that we should be teaching like this. Many of our students will go on and do politics. I'm not sure that we can really teach them how to do politics, because politics will differ in different times and different places, but still we can give them much to think about. I think we might be offering far more resources for their action than we currently do. There are public reasons for thinking about doing well, not least the public reasons that the public is thinking about doing politics, and in a rather conflicted sense. There is a sense that politics is over, that there is no meaningful difference, parties are all the same, leaders are all the same, governments are all the same, history's over. It's a question both of substance. We live in a de-ideologized world, apparently. But equally, there are problems with process. The people who do politics just don't do it very well. But at the same time, and here now in Scotland, there's an extraordinary excitement again about politics. Politics is not over, it's starting over. There seems to be a sense of beginning again. And there will be lots of argument about what we're trying to achieve, but there must be just as much argument about how we achieve it, about what we're going to be doing when we're doing politics. There are, lastly, empirical reasons for thinking that the doing of politics is somehow actually difficult to get at and therefore warrants sustained, detailed research. Politics is often disguised. Kissinger and Chu didn't do their talking in public. They couldn't possibly have. It will be difficult sometimes to understand, to get at politics as it's going on. In a different sense, much of politics has been displaced from representative bodies, parliaments and so on, to specialist scientific commissions and the like. But equally, I think we do take politics, we take action, and necessarily, we must. We take it often for granted. Politics is often hiding in plain sight, and we might spend more time helping those people who do it think about, helping them learn what they do, as the consultants would have it. Studying doing politics is going to be difficult. The Einstein prompt was that, famously, in 1946, Einstein was asked, we have the technology, we have the human resources to build the atom bomb now, but do we have the resources to figure out how not to have to use it? Or why haven't we figured out the human resources, institutions which might inhibit us from using it? To which Einstein said simply, yeah, but politics is a lot more difficult than physics. Now, I needed some way of ending, and you'll be glad I found it, and it's coming. And it's this: the purpose of sociology, don't get alarmed, purpose of sociology is to achieve an understanding of social behaviour and social institutions which is different from that current among the public through whose conduct the institutions exist. An understanding which is not simply different but better. The practice of sociology is criticism. It exists to criticise claims about the value of achievement and to question assumptions about the meaning of conduct. It's the business of sociologists to conduct a critical debate with the public about its equipment of social institutions. I think that's wonderful. It's Tom Burns, who was founding professor of sociology here at his inaugural 50 years ago. And I translated him, I guess, into this. The purpose of studying politics is to achieve an understanding of political behaviour and political institutions which is different from that current among the people through whose conduct the institutions exist. An understanding which is not simply different but better. The practice of studying politics is criticism. It exists to criticise claims about the value of achievement and to question assumptions about the meaning of conduct. It's the business of those who study politics to conduct a critical debate with the public about its equipment of political institutions, which I think seems right for now. The last word is, I was going to say it's Kissinger's. It's Kissinger's writing, but it's really Marshall Yeh. And having discovered Marshall Yeh, I couldn't leave him out. As Kissinger reports, after bidding farewell to Chu, we and the other Chinese officials had a final lunch. All tension was gone, and Marshall Yeh's normally impassive face was finally creased by smiles. On the way to the airport, he recounted some of his experiences. How over 40 years ago, as a division commander of Chiang, he heard of Mao and his 2,000 followers in the mountains and joined them. And as we drove up toward the waiting Pakistani plane, he remarked that none of them on the long march had ever dreamed to see victory in their lifetimes. They had thought their struggle was for future generations. Yet, he said, here we are, and here you are. Thank you.
That appealed to the civil servant in me, since I worked in government for a few years. But my question is, how can we actually research that? Because we have this phrase, a wonderful phrase in Norwegian, I recognize myself in a lot of what you said as someone who's worked in government
Thank you.
for so many years. But how do we as academics, now that I'm an academic this year, actually get to grips with that doing of politics, given that it's in meetings, it's in interactions, it's in the documents, it's in how those documents are formed within departments, in consultations, etc. How can we actually get to grips with those processes?
I think political science, if we hold to a mainstream understanding of political science, we would find it difficult to do that. I think it requires us to use the techniques of the sociologists and the anthropologists to be there, to do ethnography. And there are increasing numbers of really, really good ethnographies of public administration, often interestingly in development contexts, where anthropologists, it's because it's anthropologists who do stuff far away, right? And find themselves in states and ministries and do wonderful ethnographies of bureaucracy and the production of documents. I'm still looking for the study of a document that traces it from inception through drafting and debating and editing with the minister's marginal comments to new versions to it's being printed and published and so on. I think that must be possible. I mean, it would take the kind of access we can only dream of, but some people get pretty good access, and I don't see why we shouldn't negotiate. We need to be clear what we're offering, and I think we're offering for the imaginative, the imaginative civil servant, a sense to reflect on what this process is and what are we doing here and why does it work like this, how does it work. So that I think there has to be some kind of exchange here, some kind of research bargain, but I think it's possible to get to the center of the process. Some people have, and I think we might do that more, but I think we can.
Thank you.
Oliver.
Hi. You mentioned teaching, so and you teach a course on this stuff. So I wanted you to elaborate a bit more. Why should we teach new ways of thinking and doing politics?
Because it's fun. Well, I think for some of the reasons that I set out there. I mean, our students are all of those people. They are the public, the researchers, so on. But maybe the reason that I skipped was I've been struck by now teaching through case studies, largely ethnographies. I was there, accounts of life in the middle of a ministry, in the middle of a crisis. And they're extraordinarily moving. There was a real human interest in that stuff. And I have read stuff. I read a set of papers every week to teach a class, and I've been moved by it, actually. And it's worth. And I think there's something there that's worth sharing and talking about. It's the closest, without actually being in politics ourselves, but in many ways we are. Often, all of us, doing bits of politics. We're in meetings or writing documents of our own of whatever kind. But that's the best way we can. There is something thrilling about all this stuff, and there are case studies that capture and convey that buzz. It matters. There's real stuff going on there.
I thought it was interesting the stuff you were saying about how the Scottish referendum has been something that's really restarted politics, and a lot of people are talking about politics again. And I thought I think that's fine. But one thing I think I find a bit difficult is, especially if you work in places where a lot of people are political, there's no barrier to talking about the big political ideas. Like, it's not the end of history. But I think what is interesting is how difficult people find it to talk about the politics of their workplace. And I was wondering if you can talk about maybe a little bit about...
Talk about the politics of my workplace, yeah. I'd love to, yeah. That's, yes, in a way, yes. Tom Burns, who I cited at the end, is also credited with being the first to use the term micropolitics, right? Which was a study of the politics of the workplace, which begins with an account of a faculty meeting in social sciences in 1960, whatever. No, it's not easy to talk about, but that doesn't mean we should be trying to find ways of talking about the politics of the workplace and the process and the means by which things go on. I think we should, much is taken for granted, much is necessarily taken for granted. If we're going to do politics, let's organise a march, let's do this, let's do that. And there are, but equally, in those, I think perhaps particularly in activist spaces, there are lots and lots of, there's a huge amount of creative energy. I mean, this Zuccotti Park, go back to the process. There's lots and lots of thought and reflection and argument going in that context, going into the process. The civil service, I suspect, argues less about the process, and you're right to point to that being difficult. But there's much to be learned about. There are ways and ways of doing things, and you know, we're a big and complicated organisation, and to talk about the politics of my own workplace, there were better and worse ways of doing some of the things we do. And I can see it's, of course, it's challenging to talk about the ways in which, you know, we conduct our routine interactions. It destabilizes them, but what's the alternative?
You talked about language as part of the politics, and my question is, to define politics away from a Western or a Eurocentric perspective of the word politics, the etymology of the word, the synonym or the parallel meanings in different languages of the word politics, how would that take part in your study? Because the history of how people reach that equivalent of the word politics is, it defines them.
Great one, Ahmed. I think I'd leave that to you. You could do that. No, seriously, yeah. I mean, I'm interested in whether or not, clearly politics is laden with a certain conception of what that might amount to. I offered along the way various kind of ways around it, ways of thinking through it, and I'd love to know which of those were more or less resonant in really very different linguistic and cultural traditions. I don't know the answer. Your point must matter, and I don't know enough to know exactly how and why. But yeah, why don't you work on it? It'd be great.
Very good. And the last question, just down at the second row, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. You used Dorothy Smith's definition of work,
yeah.
and a lot of what you said made me think about how some people are paid for their political work handsomely and beyond all imagination, and some people do politics for a matter of survival. And I know that wasn't your exact focus, but I'm wondering what you'd say about that difference between people who are paid to do politics and people who aren't.
It's a really important point. I have wanted, for reasons I hope were clear, I wanted to develop a slightly more generic understanding than that. That must matter as to the kind of politics that gets done and by whom. And I don't know, it's a bit like Ahmed's question. I don't yet know how it matters. But I want, if nothing else, to establish a framework which prompts those are the kinds of things that we need to think about now. There are some small studies of employed political workers' employment. Some great studies, Betsy's study of volunteers working in the Democratic Party in the US. There's some good examples, some good studies on volunteering, the tension between volunteer and professional staff in parties. I don't have much more substantively to add other than to say, yeah, we need to think about that stuff.
Richard, I really enjoyed that, and I'm looking around the room. I think we have what we would call a rapt audience. I think people have really enjoyed the richness and the reflectiveness of what you said. I like the question about the politics of the workplace, and was wondering whether you could interchange the word politics in everything you've said with academia, because the meetings, the documents, the budgets, the processes, the improvisation, the sense that it's never settled also seems to describe quite a bit what we do. And I was very interested in what you said about the politics that we did in Scotland last year, which I think stretched all sorts of bounds within which we had been constrained. And I don't mean so much the formal party political, formal campaigning politics. I mean what people were doing in their meetings, with or without documents, in all sorts of places around Scotland. I was reading your CV in thinking about this evening, and there was something you said about your teaching, and I think you did it tonight with us, and that is that you are more concerned to give students ways of thinking than things to know, and I think you gave us some new ways of thinking about politics tonight, as well as a few interesting things to know, and I think we have benefited very much from it. Before I close, I'm going to call Ailsa Henderson down to the front. Ailsa's had a bit of a dramatic afternoon involving one small boy throwing a toy car at another small boy, and a quick trip to the hospital, while wanting to be here to say something to thank Richard for his contribution to the Department of Politics and International Relations.
Oh my goodness.
As Richard is about to move to the Department of Social Policy. So, Ailsa, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. So I'm very sorry I'm late. So as many of you will know, Richard is moving from politics to social policy this year, and obviously when we work in a school as we do, and particularly in a school like ours, we're used to working very closely with colleagues in other subjects. So on the one hand, this won't be much of an adjustment. There were early signs that Richard maybe found this a slightly less traumatic adjustment than we did. There was the day he quickly disappeared from our list of staff, and we didn't really notice, and then he popped up on the social policy site, and then there was the email that he sent requesting that no one send him any further messages from politics. He didn't want to know what we were doing in our staff meetings. Anymore.
It's politics. It's all about sorting out messages.
But we felt that we would be remiss if we didn't mark the occasion in some way, and it's a strange thing to mark, because obviously you're not retiring, you're just moving over a little bit. But we thought that certainly what we should do is thank you for all that you have done for us, and particularly part of the reason that we performed so well in the ref this past time was because of the leadership that we've had from you over the years. So we have something for you. Well, we have two things for you. The bigger thing you can take it. The bigger thing is.
Can I show the?
Yes. It's something from all of us. So it says Professor Richard Freeman, doing politics at Edinburgh since 1994. And we've all signed it. I've got the pen still here because I see there are some people who haven't yet signed it. We can flip up in the back if you want. But the other thing is something that we thought should become a tradition within politics. And even though you're moving from politics to social policy, we thought that it was fitting that you would be the first recipient of our new traditional gift for politics people that have their inaugural lectures.
Should I open it now?
You can. But that's.
My goodness.
Okay, while Richard struggles with his
Hold on.
inaugural
I'm getting
gift.
there.
I hope this is not necessarily a tradition that you get the mug and then you move department.
There we go.
Show it off, Richard.
How did Santa was explosive
If you can.
device? Dude, hey, made it now, guys.
So with that, we should probably finish with a final round of applause, but also an invitation to head outside and have a drink to celebrate what has been a very fine occasion. Thank you, Richard.